Well, hello everyone. It's just about 10 o'clock. Here we are, rarely on a Saturday morning for the Natural History Society of Maryland. For those who don't know, I'm Matthew. I'm the club coordinator, and we are here with Joe Shute, the author of Stowaway, the disreputable history the disreputable exploits of the rat. I'm a big fan of this book. For those who missed this, when you registered for this Zoom call, you should have received a code which will entitle you to 20% off the cover price of this book. So hopefully many of you have already taken advantage of that and ordered a copy and read it. If you have not yet, then perhaps in the next 45 minutes or so, you'll hear something that inspires you to go and pick up your copy. That code is still valid, 20% off. If you have any issues with that, just contact me or Bronwyn at NHSM, and we will walk you through the process. But this is a super interesting book. As I was just saying to Joe, I'm really impressed with the quality of the research and the variety of different sources that are used. We've got everything from primary historical documents to references to folklore and pop culture to scientific journal articles, and that's all combined with some old-fashioned intrepid reporting. Joe's traveled all over the world. He's in Paris, he's in Alberta, Canada, he's in Africa. And then woven through that is a kind of a first-person memoir about your own developing appreciation of and relationship with rats. And there's some very moving passages about your husbandry of your pet rats and how that evolves for you over time. And all of this is very fluently woven together into a very compelling overview of the bad rep that the rats get, and maybe a call for greater compassion between our world and theirs. It's hard for us to share, to coexist with other species historically, especially species that are so much like us in so many ways. So I was really happy to read this. Somebody just said in the chat, Ronan the rat got into the Guinness Book of Records for uncovering more than 100 landmines. Nice job, Ronan. And Joe mentions that in this book, the process of training the rats. And I kind of like am one of these people who thinks that my dream job would be the rat tickler. That was so great. But anyway, thank you so much for being here, Joe. And I'm going to turn it over to you and I'm going to stop talking. We're going to go for maybe about 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So if folks have questions as we go along, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll try to get to those when we can. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and I really appreciate it and look forward to learning about rats.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you everyone for giving up your Saturday morning to spend some time with me and some rat stories. It is actually fantastic timing, not just for the exploits of Ronin, which were reported in the news yesterday. I actually met Ronin when I went over to the Apopo charity in Tanzania, and back then he was tipped for future stardom as one of the great landmine sniffing rats in their colony of the future. So I'm delighted to see he's living up to that potential. And the second thing is I noted yesterday was World Rat Day as well, which actually I had no idea existed prior to writing the book. But yes, so it's good timing all round. And I'm delighted when I first heard my book was being published in America as well, I was delighted for lots of reasons, but particularly because it's two American books that really were the ones that inspired my project. The first is, I'd recommend them both to you. I'm sure one of them, some of you will have read anyway. The first is a book by a New Yorker writer and a journalist like me called Robert Sullivan, who's written a history of New York through the rats that live there. And it's 20 years old now or so, but he spends a lot of time, which like me, I ended up over the course of researching this book, going on urban rat safaris and standing on street corners in dodgy parts of town and getting very strange looks from people about what are you doing, staking out the rats of the alleys. But it gave me an idea of the kind of history that's entwined with rats, the human history that's entwined with them, and what they show and reflect back to us as well. The second book is very different. It is Robert C. O'Brien's Rats of Nim. a children's book, which I'm sure some of you will have read. And it's about the rats escaping a testing laboratory and their dream to set up a colony for themselves, free of human interference, a place where they wouldn't have to steal and pillage from human stores, but could grow their own crops and build a life for themselves. And I found that very moving, and actually the idea of considering a rat's life from a rat's perspective, a very interesting one, and not one that humans are particularly prone to doing throughout our history. So that's what I've attempted to do through this book, to break free of the baggage that humans project onto rats and see them for a species on their own terms, to understand their motivations, their complexities, and really see them for the incredible creatures that they are. Forgive me. So, this book, and I was explaining this to Matthew before, as this is my third book, and I've got a long-standing interest in scavenging species, because they're species that they are sort of interwoven with humans, and you can't get any more so than that than the rat. A couple of years ago in the Jurassic Coast in the UK, a PhD student made an incredible discovery of two teeth lodged in the rock of the cliffs, which it turned out dated back to the early Cretaceous period and belonged to what were since proved as the earliest known mammals on Earth and humanity's earliest ancestor. So while we kind of like to tell ourselves a sort of a human's kind of hero myth, I suppose, of a kind of rampaging through the world and being heroes of our own story. In fact, far more likely is that we were kind of rat-like scavenging creatures ourselves, which scuttled around, making most of opportunities wherever they emerged. From then till now, rodents have gone on to be astonishingly successful. They comprise the largest group of mammals on Earth. Roughly around 40% of all mammalian species are rodents of one sort or another. Of them, there are more than 60 species of rat, including some quite incredible diverse species of ones that live underground and ones that are real sort of specialists. But my book focuses on two rats, and these are the rats that all of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. The first is the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, and the second, the black rat, Rattus rattus. Um, as part of my research, I kind of understood why these two in particular have gone on to be so successful. And it's the fact that they're generalists and can survive in a huge variety of very extreme habitats and situations. But also, talking to rat biologists, it's their ability, and this is a very rare thing among rodents. While some rodents, like squirrels, for example, can gnaw and other rodents can chew. And what rats can do, when you look at a rat's skull, you have the very powerful front teeth that are so powerful they can chew through concrete. It's something I've written about in the book. I experienced in my own house, where a large brown rat tunneled up through the floor of our outside potting shed to get to some chicken food that was inside. But they also have these teeth at the back where they can, like molar-like teeth, where they can chew as well. So the ability to do both of those things has really, as well as their kind of incredible physical prowess, their ability to swim and climb and burrow, fit through tiny holes by shrinking their very skeletons down to be able to do it, has turned them into really formidable creatures. And that is shown in the extent to which they've conquered the world. Both of the rats originate in the east of the world, black rats from India and brown rats from China. But from there, they have gone on to conquer every continent apart from Antarctica. The title of my book, Stowaway, is because the reason they've been able to do that is stowing away along human trade routes. In short, wherever humans have gone, rats have followed. And that extends now to unpopulated islands where rats have managed to escape sinking ships and swum to the safety of shore and colonized particular islands. In a way, they're living their rats of Nim destiny there, but on some islands, they can be really lethal to seabird populations as well. It's not just seabirds that rats pose a threat to. According to the World Health Organization, rats cause more than 400 million infections in people every year through bites, fleas, and the urine and other aerosols they spray around. And rats are widely feared to be harboring the next great pandemic in humans as well. Studies have shown that they carry at least 60 pathogens which can infect humans, including all sorts of incredibly nasty hemorrhagic fevers, coronaviruses, hantaviruses, and arenaviruses. And then if that wasn't enough, it's estimated that rodents eat around 1/5 of the global food supply every year. So you can see why the word pest could not be better suited to a creature like the rat. A lot of my research directed me towards New York for various reasons. It's one of the great ratty cities of the world. And interestingly, it's one of the places where the city authorities are the latest in a very long line when you look at the history of municipal authorities around the world to suddenly decide to declare war on rats. Eric Adams, his administration, and shortly before all of the corruption charges which were leveled against him. It felt to me like he was kind of picking on rats to potentially deflect from that somehow. But they have now followed in the case of the UK and the 20th century, in particular around the Second World War, when the Women's Land Army were tasked with eradicating rats from all over the countrysides and were given all sorts of incredibly toxic chemicals to carry out the job. Things like spraying hedgerows with cyanide gas and tarmacking over any rat holes that they found. Similarly, Boy Scouts in the UK were tasked with eradicating rats. In Paris, after a plague outbreak there in the early 20th century, the entire citizens were mobilized to wipe out the rat population, and people were paid a bounty for any bodies of rats that they would present to the local authorities. Again, the thing that history tells us is these rat wars are astonishingly unsuccessful. If you attempt to just try and kill rats without addressing the human reasons that they're there, and they are always human reasons, then you will never succeed. And interestingly, I've been trying to keep abreast of the rat situation in New York, and it seems like they are finding some success now, but not by killing rats, but by altering the way that they deal with rubbish disposal in the city. This Columbia study found that the average New York subway rat carried 18 novel viruses not yet detected in humans, along with dozens of familiar pathogens. But these are all, when you begin to look at rat science, as I did through this book, it very quickly becomes apparent how little we actually know about them. Far more energy has been devoted over the years and still today to try and eradicate rats than understanding how they live in the wild. This sense of a kind of seasoned rat catcher was something that you particularly find in UK history during the 19th century, as when the country was rapidly urbanizing as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the poor housing conditions, with people sort of packed together in extremely unsanitary situations, meant that you would get a large amount of rats moving in with them as well. Rat catchers became sort of celebrities of Victorian London, and particularly the guy whose picture is on the screen now, Jack Black, who he was self-appointed. he says he was appointed by the Queen herself, but when I looked into the history of it, he was definitely self-appointed rat catcher to Queen Victoria herself. And he features in a lot of accounts of London life at the time, where he was a real showman. He would, you can see his belt there, which is cast with moldings of rats that he took himself. And the VR Victoria Regina is the brand of the Queen that he would wear. He would have a sort of stool that he would wheel around the streets of London and always carry with him a few cages of live rats that he would delight his audiences by plunging his hand into them and emerging holding a rat and claiming that he'd never been bitten by a rat in his life. Although several accounts say that when you looked up close, his entire arms were covered in the scars of various rat bites that he'd been involved in. So this sense of the kind of rat catcher, the way that we could only deal with rats was by expunging them from our cities, persists really into the modern era. And my book begins by me joining one of there are still a few in the UK traditional rat catchers that still act in the same way that Jack Black and the 19th century rat catchers would have done, whereby they used dogs and refuse to use poisons and instead kind of carry on what they think is a real art form and describe it as an art form. There was one rat catcher in London around Regent's Canal in Camden, which if any of you have ever visited, you'll know it's a very ratty location. And he described to me how it was a real sort of trade. His dad was a rat catcher as well, and it had really passed through the family. It was something that he was very proud of to do it a traditional way with the traditional hunting for terriers. Very brutal, but he said it was an art form nonetheless. And he said they were often very disparaged by clients when they showed up. And I'm probably not allowed to swear on this, so I won't. But he did tell me when he's dealing with a particularly rude client, he'd say, if rats were that easy to catch, then you would effing do it yourself, which I always thought was a fantastic quote. Um, but we're beginning to move away from just this idea of killing rats because it doesn't work. Rats are going to stick around, and there's a sort of increasingly cities around the world, city authorities around the world are realizing that the idea of a war on the rat, which persisted throughout the 20th century, is doomed to fail. And actually, their coexistence is really the only solution. Now, this is combined with a lot of modern scientific research that is revealing, doing what I kind of outlined at the start of this talk. We're beginning to look at rats on their own terms. And in doing so, revealing that they are remarkable creatures with incredibly complex inner lives. Again, very similar to our own. Recent studies have shown that rats display empathy, possess the power of imagination, love to play hide and seek, and I've seen that with my own rats, certainly. And there's a scientist in the US who's done some incredible research looking at the ability of rats to drive cars. I urge you to go onto YouTube and seek it out for yourself. They're fantastic, life-affirming videos where they're these kind of size of a remote-controlled car that rats can drive by pressing a pedal for a button, and they're rewarded with a treat at the end. The only thing that the rats haven't been able to do is master braking. So each time they kind of drive into this crash barrier at the end and then leap out to be rewarded with a treat. In the US as well, there's also an annual Rat Olympics at Nebraska University, which has been going on for several decades now. Where students are giving rats at the start of the term and they teach them to perform all kinds of incredible tricks, tests of both physical and mental ability. They've had to rebrand it because I think they got a legal warning from the actual Olympics that they were stealing their name. So it's called the Extreme Rat Challenge. But again, look it up. And if any of you ever find yourself near Nebraska, it's open to the public as well. I know I would love to go at one time. But there was one study in particular that I loved about rats, and it came out just a couple of years ago. And a group of scientists played a series of different tunes to rats and monitored their reactions to them. They varied from Mozart to Beethoven to Lady Gaga, and they noticed that the rats were not only moving, dancing, as it was described, to the music, but also they were dancing at the exact same beats per minute as humans have been shown to most enjoy music as well. This rhythmic swaying of the rats found that they were the only animal aside from humans that loved to dance. So I started writing my book in lockdown, a time in the UK when many people were buying lockdown puppies. The craze for lockdown puppies was absolutely huge, and me and my wife we went in a slightly different direction and decided to get some lockdown rat pups instead. My wife Liz, who's the illustrator of the book as well, she had always wanted rats as a kid and was never allowed them. So when I mentioned to her that I was writing a book about rats and was thinking about getting some, she within seconds of the words leaving my mouth said, "Yes, let's do it," and looked up local breeders, of which there was happily one down the road that we could, because it was lockdown. We went and picked up the rats in her garage, and it was a very sort of surreptitious nighttime meeting, as they often were back then. But for me, it was far more of a mental hurdle to overcome. I'm a lover of nature and the natural world. My writing as an author and a journalist is, I specialize in the environment, and it's the passion for the environment that really drives me as a writer. But I always had a natural aversion to rats. They made my skin crawl thinking about them. If I would see a rat in the wild, which growing up in London and now living in Sheffield, a kind of a very urban city in the north of England, with a lot of rivers, which is ideal rat habitat, you see a lot of rats, and that kind of jump that I'm sure some of you may have experienced when you see a rat. That's always something I would have, and I wanted to interrogate that through the book. And kind of understand where that sense of loathing was coming from within myself. Was it, something cultural? Was it something that I was taught, or was it something innate within me? So the first two rats we picked up were Ermintrude, or Squirms, as she very quickly became nicknamed for her ability to wriggle through any hole and dart around the house, and Molly. They're the rats that you can see in the main picture on the far left. So Ermintrude is the grey and white one, and Molly is the dark brown and white one. They were sisters and hooded rats, but otherwise they are exactly the same species as the brown rat that you would see scampering around the towns and cities of America. They are Rattus norvegicus. They just descend then what's known as fancy rats. But all that means is they have a different colored fur and slightly different shaped ears to brown rats. But otherwise, they're identical species. When I was first getting to know them, really that kind of cultural fear came to the fore for me. And it was something that Liz found hilarious. Obviously, it was lockdown, so we had a lot of time on our hands. So we spent a lot of time playing with our rats. And at first, I couldn't even have them sort of scampering along me. I remember very early on, Molly, who was by far the more adventurous of the two, creeping up and sitting on my shoulder, and me being absolutely petrified and having to call Liz to come and take this rat off again. And it was a real sort of learning curve for me over the course of our time together, because what I sort of realized and what I document in the book is the way that they are such sensitive creatures and show such empathy for each other as well. They very playful, and they were like puppies really. They would you could call them, and if they heard one of us walking up the stairs, they would kind of leap out and rattle the bars, wanting to come out and play. Incredibly clever. They mapped out our house in their heads and would often explore the different floors of it, and you could call them back as you could with a dog or a cat when it was time for their food to get them back in. and also their sense of cooperation as well, which is something rat colonies have become, has led them to become so important and so successful because they work incredibly well together. So after a while, we decided to add two more rats to our colony, Rita and her sister Agatha. We did so because Ermintrude was getting old. They were only a couple of years old at that point, but the great tragedy of rats as pets, the only downside of rats as pets is their very short lifespan of between 2 and 3 years. And it's a very difficult thing to deal with because you grow seriously attached to these creatures. I love them as I've loved the cats I had as a child and any pet because they have such personality and they're so sweet and so much fun to have around as well. When Ermintrude was particularly showing signs of age, we visited a rat show near us, and we were advised by several of the breeders there to get young rats, and they will kind of enliven the older rats as it would be with humans if they have grandchildren around. And so we were given Rita and Agatha by a rat breeder, and that exactly happened. They immediately set up this very happy colony between the four of them. They would sleep together every night, and often, as you can see in the bottom right there, kind of cram into makeshift hammocks that Liz made out of old pairs of pants and sleep happily together, swaying in that. I mention a rat show because this is a massive thing in the UK. There's a real history of it, dating back all the way to Beatrix Potter, the writer in the early 20th century, who was part of a kind of Victorian Edwardian fashion among young women in high society to keep pet rats. This spawned into the National Fancy Rat Appreciation Society, which exists today. And if any of you are familiar with Crufts, which is a sort of famous dog show that happens in the UK every year, this is the rat version of Crufts. So they have shows all over the country, and breeders will present their best rats, which will be judged on things like the glossiness of the fur and the bristliness of their whiskers. And it's an incredibly interesting subculture of rat lovers, which I had no idea existed until I started writing this book. There was another study I saw with my rats, which said that rats can possess the ability to grieve dead rats, and I saw this with my own ones, particularly when Ermintrude sadly died. Molly, her sister, was overcome with grief for a few days. When we found her, when we found Ermintrude dead in the cage, Molly had pulled over a scrap of cloth over her body and was lying next to her while the other two rats were at the bottom of the cage. Once we'd removed Ermintrude and buried her in the spot where all of our rats are buried together now, because sadly, our last rat, Rita, died a couple of months ago, bringing an end to the colony. And she, after her death, Molly, for a good few days, couldn't eat, was incredibly listless, and yeah, was exactly as you would see a human responding to grief. Eventually, she snapped out of it, and having two young rats, Rita and Agatha, to kind of playing around her, cheered her up, and she managed to move on. But it was such a powerful thing to see the strength of rat grief and see what that looks like. I mentioned the colony ended, and yeah, we're in the market for new rats. But as I explained to Matthew, we've it coincided with our last rat existing. We had a baby come into our lives, so we're quite busy looking after the baby at the minute. But new rats are on the horizon for sure. So this idea of our cultural expectation of rats and the reality of them is what increasingly became apparent to me over the course of writing this book, and how little we know about them. For example, if you look at estimates of Britain's rat population, and it took me a while to get these numbers correct, so I haven't done the same for the US, but I'm sure it's the same answer, which is essentially scientists have absolutely no idea when you look through a lot of the literature, it's stuff that is put out there by pest control companies. So people who obviously have a vested interest in a perception of there being a considerable amount of rats alive that urgently need dealing with. But talking to rodentologists, the rat population range in the UK is from 10.5 million to in excess of 200 million, which gives you an idea of the sort of knowledge gaps that we're talking about. Rodentologists are a very close-knit community. Over the course of writing this book, I interviewed the people considered the world's leading rodentologists, and they agree on this, that it's a sort of branch of science which is uh, sort of, I don't want to say kind of downplayed, but they feel slightly overlooked by more sort of broader zoology, perhaps. And also that the many of the rat myths that are told and that we tell ourselves are untrue. So there's obviously the old adage, you are never more than 6 foot from a rat, which exists in many cities around the world. And as does other rat myths. So this idea of the king rat or the rat king, which is particularly when I've given talks, it's something a lot of young people will ask me at the end. I'll see a hand go up and say, "Have you ever seen a rat king?" And this is the idea that you get so many rats concentrated in a small area that their tails become knotted together. So you go from one rat to having 10 rats, which are sort of interlinked and scuttle crab-like about through the sewers. If you look at it on Google, there are pictures of king rats that have been found. But if you talk to rodentologists, they'll tell you that it's utter rubbish and has never occurred anywhere. There is one rat myth, though, that I always gave me shudders when I first started writing the book, and I'm afraid to report is actually true, and particularly so in America, and particularly so in New York. And this is the notion that people, while sitting on the toilet, have had rats swimming up the downpipe and biting them on the bottoms. And I spoke to several very respected rodentologists who told me this is absolutely the case. And particularly in New York is down to the plumbing of some of the old brownstone buildings, which lends itself very well to this. National Geographic actually did a demonstration of this, which you can find on YouTube, of the speed at which a rat can swim up a U-bend of a toilet. And it's fascinating to watch, not least because it demonstrates the incredible swimming ability of rats. In the UK, there's studies that have shown rats diving down to the beds of rivers to retrieve freshwater mussels that are on the beds of them and swimming back up to the surface again. Incredibly powerful swimmers, and the way they can navigate, the way they can twist their bodies to navigate very close confines like a toilet U-bend is very impressive to watch as well. I do have to give the trigger warning that you'll never sit happily on the toilet ever again in your life once you've watched it, but I'd encourage it all the same. But the biggest myth of all around rats, the biggest sort of slur on their reputation is as transmitters of plague, harbingers of plague. In fact, you know, the reason behind the Black Death, which wiped out millions of the European population, and successive plague pandemics across the world. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that the story that we were all told in school, that the plague is caused by rat fleas, is actually incorrect. Well, kind of incorrect, because even though the rats do carry plague fleas on them, and these plague fleas transmit very easily to humans. Scientists have been looking at the speed of Black Death and other plague pandemics and found that it's traveled at a rate far faster than could be possible if it was shifting from rat fleas to carriers. It would take far too long. And they've actually found that it's through human aerosols. So it's plague transmitted through people's breath and coughs and sneezes, etc. And that they think is why plague spread so fast and so far across the world. Rather than rats, it was people carrying the plague. And actually, one authoritative study that came out a couple of years ago looked at the dates of one of the main plague pandemics and the climatic conditions at the time, and concluded that in fact it was gerbils in China rather than rats that were a more likely source of the plague. There was at the time there was a lot of rain and the ideal conditions for wild gerbil populations, which they reckon there was an absolute boom of that year. And they feel it was the fleas, the plague fleas carried on the gerbils that year rather than rats, which led to the plague, which then sort of blossomed across the world. Near to where I live in Sheffield, there's a village called Eyam, which is a very famous plague village and receives visitors from all over the world. It's famous because it's the one of the earliest examples of lockdown. In the 17th century, plague arrived in the village through a bundle of fleas on a bundle of rags that a tailor had brought up from London. And very quickly, families in the village, it's a tiny village in the Peak District of just a few hundred people, but people started dying. And the rector of the church, being aware of what was happening, decided to lock down the village to protect the surrounding area. And the people of Eyam were in a self-imposed quarantine for about 18 months, I think. And more than half of the village population died, but they maintained this quarantine all the way through. Other villages, you can see they're called plague stones. They're dotted around the village, and other villagers would, from elsewhere, would bring food and leave them on these plague stones, which would then be taken into the village to provide sustenance for the quarantining residents. Again, rats were blamed for that, and actually they have an annual bonfire celebration where you can see a not very good picture of it there. But the children of the village spend an entire year building a giant papier-mâché rat, which is then paraded through the village with burning torches. It's very medieval when you witness it, as I did. Quite shocking, actually. And this rat is then thrown onto a bonfire for the whole village to start cheering and chanting burn the rat," over and over and over again. When me and Liz, my wife, went to see it, we were both quite taken aback and felt like we should be defending the rats. But anyway, we don't need to do that because a group of scientists have done that for us, and they've investigated the individual deaths in the over the course of the plague outbreak. And again, they found out that the speed of it means it's far more likely that it was humans spreading plague rather than rats. The other great myth that is increasingly being challenged is this idea of rats simply as destructors, and actually a greater understanding of the sensitivity of the rat's place in ecosystems themselves. As I've said, they are disastrous when their populations are out of control, particularly to seabirds. There's an island, very important seabird colony in the UK called Lundy, where scientists wiped out every rat there. Or conservationists, sorry, did about 20 years ago, and the seabird population has since trebled. Yeah, they can be sort of disastrous there, but elsewhere, rats also are a vital source of food for other predators and surprising ones. Again, if I could direct you to YouTube, there are some stomach-churning videos of herons gobbling down rats whole, which they fish out of waterways. There's one I've seen in Central Park in New York, which is particularly impressive. And I had no idea that herons would go for rats like that. Similarly, birds of prey, raptors, number of owls feast on rats and suffer very badly from widespread rodenticide poisoning as well. Barn owls in particular are extremely susceptible to it. And numerous studies have shown the extent to which rodenticides are prevalent in barn owl populations. and also snakes. I visited a farm in the countryside near to us for the book, which was doing some interesting rat prevention work, where rather than using rodenticides or traditional approaches, they were encouraging wildlife in to maintain populations of the rats and actually seeing some really interesting results. So, for example, in their compost heaps, which once were populated by breeding rats and were ideal places for rats to build their nests. They instead sculpted large ponds nearby, which brought grass snakes into the area. And the grass snakes had taken up residence in the compost heaps, and they think were eating the rat babies. Similarly, they set up large raptor poles all over the land. So very large wooden totem poles almost, where raptors could perch on the top and scan the surrounding land for prey that they could then dive down on. And they'd seen some dramatic improvements on the extent to which rats were impacting the food that they were growing, and all without laying down a single chemical. So the book really then begins to settle on the idea of a different relationship with rats. And it's been mentioned already, the hero rats of Apopo. As part of my work, as part of my research for the book, I visited Apopo's headquarters in Morogoro in Tanzania, where for decades now, these rats and their giant African pouch rats are trained up to detect landmines. They're so successful because, like all rats, they have an incredible power of smell, so they can smell dynamite in the ground. Even though they're big and long-lived, this species of rat lives around 7 years, so the training is worthwhile. But they're not big enough to trigger a landmine. And finally, as you can see from the picture at the top, they are, like all rat species, incredibly greedy. There, the hero rat is being given its favorite treat of an avocado smoothie, which they're rewarded with when they detect landmines. So these rats will happily scuttle across fields studded with lethal weaponry if they know they're going to get an avocado smoothie at the end of it. When I visited back in 2020, I think it was 2021, perhaps, the latest hero rat, Magawa, who was their most prolific of all mine detecting rat, had just died. And it made global news at the time because he was the first rat to be awarded the PDSA Medal for Bravery. This is an award for animal bravery that was coined early in the 20th century and was given to dogs and horses during the Second World War. And ever since for various conflict situations. Magawa was the first ever rat to receive this medal. And as I said at the time, I was told that Ronin was going to be his great successor, and now Ronin 2 is no doubt in line for another one of these medals. He's sniffed out 100 different landmines personally, Ronin now in Cambodia. The Apopo rats are sent all over the world to places where there's a legacy of landmines. Lots of countries in Africa like Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, and yeah, Cambodia, Laos. The rats are all being used to get in. Collectively, they've cleared in excess of 160,000 landmines across the globe. But while I was there, they were beginning to show me other ways in which they were using rats to benefit humanity. One very interesting one was their ability to screen tuberculosis samples. Again, by their power of smell, they could detect samples that had tuberculosis on them, and were doing so far cheaper and far faster than human scientists could manage. And particularly in a place like Morogoro, where electricity is intermittent and there are often breaks in the power and so on. These rats can keep working in any conditions. And they were dealing with a lot of sort of questioning from the medical community, the idea of using rats to screen samples. But nonetheless, clinics from all over the country are now couriering in samples to be tested by the Apopo rats because they can do them so quickly and so effectively as well. And while I was there, I was also shown another project where they were beginning to train the rats up as search and rescue specialists. This is the idea that in the aftermath of an earthquake or some other natural disaster, when bodies are trapped beneath the rubble, rats could be an ideal thing to send in there because of their ability to squeeze into such small spaces. I was shown a test room which had been set up to resemble the aftermath of an earthquake, and the rats were sent in, and they had little geolocators on their rucksacks and cameras, as you can see in the picture of the left, which would relay what they were seeing back to human operators in the field. But even for a human being rescued from certain death, they were slightly worried about how they might react to a rat coming to save them. So the scientists, as well as giving them this high-tech equipment on their rucksacks, had added a recorded message that would be played when they located a particular person. And it said, "Hello, I'm a hero rat, and I'm here to save you." Matthew mentioned two different places I visited, Paris and Alberta, for the book. I've highlighted them here because they really show the dichotomy of living with rats that we're beginning to see in the modern era. Alberta, famously, if you look at maps of rat distribution across North America, there is an interesting a blip in Alberta where the authorities claim since the after the Second World War that they've been able to keep the entire province entirely rat-free. They've done this because of Alberta's unique geography, where it has the Rocky Mountains to the west, and Alaska to the north, and just woodlands to the south, which are incredibly sparsely populated. So the only way that they've decided that rats can get into the country is along about an 800 mile eastern border with the neighboring province of Saskatchewan. And after the Second World War, the authorities decided that rats could potentially cause such damage to Alberta's farmers, which were a huge part of their economy, that they were going to wipe every one of them out by having sort of the kind of citizens' brigades, which I've mentioned, and recruiting a specialist rat catcher called Napoleon Poulin, who was given basically a blank check to distribute as much poison and as possible around the landscape to wipe out rats, and photographs of it. There are literally carts full of rats that they killed. But the difference here with other citizens' brigades, which have always failed in history, is that they've kept up rat patrols ever since. So I went to join one of these rat patrols for they start in spring after the particularly freezing winters begin to thaw, and they drive in pickup trucks along the Alberta border, visiting farms and responding to any sighting of a rat. There's a hotline that people can ring at any time, and they will immediately scramble these rat patrols to the scene wherever they are in the province to wipe out the rats. This includes pet rats as well. If anyone has a pet rat in Alberta, the authorities seize them and send them to rat or animal shelters outside of the province. And it's been a success. They've invested huge amounts of money in it, but they claim today that Alberta continues to be rat-free. But this is an outlier. As I mentioned, coexistence is increasingly something that authorities are looking at. And there's an interesting tale or an interesting project in Paris, which is looking exactly at that, finally attempting to understand the way rats live on their own terms. It's got a title of Project Armageddon, which really doesn't quite do justice to the fact that it's a very sensitive project, understanding how rats live in the city and pioneering as well in terms of their findings. For example, they've done genetic studies of the rat populations around Paris and found that while they expected the genetics to be entirely mixed because of interbreeding and intermingling between the city's rat population, actually what they found is the different pockets of rats in different neighborhoods around the city are genetically distinct. And their conclusion about this is that because rats are fiercely territorial, but also fiercely cooperative within their own colonies as well. They think the city, much like kind of crime families, different rat families have different patches of the city which they rule over and will prevent sort of incursions. So from elsewhere. So what you have there is a sense of rats keeping rat populations under control themselves, which I thought was fascinating. There are other cities in Europe which are looking at an even more extreme forms of coexistence now. In Amsterdam, scientists are proposing having rat feeding stations in city parks where uh, the rats can come and sort of nibble at feeders like birds or squirrels, and members of the public can watch them do it to understand that they're perhaps not these creatures to be um, regarded with outright fear and hatred as so many of us do. So perhaps, and this is my hopeful conclusion of the book, that we are shifting towards the idea, the sense of coexistence that was outlined in Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. That rather than rats constantly having to hide away from humans and live sort of scuttle about in our shadows, steal our food and so on, that one day they might be able to live more freely and with a greater sense of empathy and understanding around them. Um, we've got a long way to go, but it's a very interesting point in the very long checkered history between rats and humans. And perhaps by the end of this century, it will be commonplace to have rats, sniffer rats in airports around the world, rats working hand in hand with medical professionals to heal human health. Rats continuing to sniff out landmines and other weapons of war which humans have located, have dumped around the world, and also using rats in the wildlife trafficking trade as well. In Tanzania, they're beginning to be deployed into shipping containers to sniff out things like smuggled tiger parts and rhino parts, which are so devastating for wild populations, but which is big business for in Asia, and the ports of Africa are a real kind of hotbed of it. But actually, you've got the rats working to kind of alert these smuggling routes. And it was interesting. I spoke to some of the people involved in that, and they said that while there was always a concern with human shipping operators that they may be susceptible to bribes or other kind of thing to get to grease the wheels of trade, the rats were unimpeachable and nothing could ever sway them. So that brings my talk to an end, and I hope it was of some interest, and I'd be delighted to answer or attempt to answer any ratty questions any of you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. There's a few questions coming in the chat here. First of all, Karen wants to know, when you let your pets roam around your home, did they ever try to get outdoors?
No, they never tried to get outdoors. And we kind of, at first, we would sort of encourage it a bit because we thought it'd be nice for them to scamper about on our lawn or whatever it was. But actually, we realized they were quite scared of going outdoors, and they're very cautious creatures. And I think there's a whole, they knew our house, and as I mentioned, rats, they'd mapped out our house, and that was very obvious in their movements around there. All kind of studies show that rats have an uncanny ability to do that, and they need it for the kind of subterranean lives that they lead, where they map out urban environments and they map out routes between where their food is and where they sleep at night, where their nests are. And but outside, the smell was different, and the kind of extent of other predators there. And there was really yeah, it was quite instinctive in the rats where they didn't really want to go there. So that was fine. We left them to scuttle around on the carpet instead.
I think you mentioned somewhere in the book that if left to their own devices, the rats will continue to follow the same pathways for generations
Yeah,
if
yeah.
people don't intervene. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
they have really sort of defined routes that they take, and you can see them in urban areas. I mentioned the kind of urban rat safaris that I did, and particular scraps of wasteland. You can see this where there's long grass left to grow, but there are healthy rat populations there, and you can see rat lines through the long grass where the rats will follow exactly the same line, sort of mowing the lawn as they go almost.
Another question. Is there ongoing research about what insects rats eat?
Oh, I don't know about that. Yeah, I'm not sure. They are incredibly generalist in their diets and will eat almost anything. It's why they, can be of such benefit to humans when they're living in sewers, particularly uh, where sewers become blocked and things like fatbergs, which are these disgusting things we have in the UK, which are overwhelming our Victorian sewers, and rats are vital in that, in sort of dealing with human waste. I'm sure they would eat earthworms. To be honest, I'm sure they would eat almost anything they encountered, but I'm not sure of any exact studies into it.
Are squirrels considered to be trained for similar purposes as the rats are being trained? That's interesting.
No, squirrels, and I spoke to a few rodentologists about this, and squirrels are certainly the kind of experts I've spoken to. They were quite disparaging towards squirrels in terms of their, particularly around their cleverness. I mentioned the Paris project, and part of that, when they were doing the genetic testing, they were constantly out trapping rats in the urban environment and taking samples from them and then releasing them again. And the scientists involved with it, a guy called Benoit, who's a real expert who's been doing this his entire career, said that you would never catch the same rat twice. Once a rat had been caught once, it would always, because they marked them and they tagged them, so they knew if they'd get one again. So they were far too clever to trigger it again. Squirrels, on the other hand, he would catch the same squirrel about 5 times on a single morning. And yeah, they are seen as possessing far less impressive brains to rats and far less ability to sort of train as a result. I'm sure there are squirrel scientists that feel very different as a caveat.
That may have been a controversial point. When I put this up on YouTube, you're going to hear from all of the squirrel enthusiasts. How dare you malign our squirrels? Uh, in Baltimore, as you probably know, we have a reputation for being a very rat-focused city. We're known for our rats. So if you do a sequel, maybe spend some time in Baltimore and you'll hear a
Oh
lot
yeah,
about
I'd
both
love to
rats
visit
and
Baltimore.
squirrels.
Yeah,
Probably has something to do with being a port city as well as just like an old city, right? So they've had time to develop a
sure.
community here. I think that might be it for questions. Any other questions, folks? Or Joe? Stowaway, the disreputable exploits of the rat. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Joe. Enjoyed that talk a lot. Get the book, everybody. Um, Read the book, learn about rats. Thank you all for supporting the Natural History Society of Maryland. Joe Shute, everyone. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you for having me.